The best summer reading often means comfort reading, those books we turn to time and time again. And that's certainly true of the next book recommendation we'll hear. As this long, hot summer winds down, we've turned to WABE hosts to tell us about their favorite reads as part of our Page Turners series. And we begin with local Weekend Edition host John Lorinc, who, as it turns out, is a big fan of classic rock, and especially of one quartet from Liverpool. I'd imagine that there are hundreds of books on the Beatles, and I have a feeling that you've read them all, John Lorinc, since you are a tremendous Beatles fan. What characterizes this particular book, published in 2005, The Beatles by Bob Spitz? What makes it different?
Well, you are right. It's probably thousands, and they go from, very silly books to very deep books. But when it comes to this book in particular, I really like how it's deep. I think it's almost 1,000 pages. To me, it's always been a fascinating story. For 1 second, forget about the music about the Beatles. Just forget about it. These are 4 guys from the sticks, Liverpool, England. And by the time they're 21, 22, they're household names. They're millionaires. They've changed the way people look at music. They changed music. They changed pop culture, all those things. And to me, that's just a fascinating story about how people from a very provincial city that no one's ever heard of changed the world. Now add all the music, and if you like the Beatles music, then you can add all that with it. So in this book in particular, I feel that it's deep enough for someone who, like me, has read a bunch of books before, but it's well written, and sometimes it's almost even poetic.
Do you have an example of that?
I do. So this is talking about a busy day in 1965 whenever the Beatles were recording the Help album. And for whatever reason, the way it timed out was they were doing 3 Paul songs that day. And then the last one, here's how it's worded. To make Paul feel more comfortable, Martin, as in George Martin, their producer, had the studio lights dimmed to a shade resembling candlelight and moved the other Beatles out of his sight line before retreating with the engineers into the overhead control booth. There was a short last-minute lull while Smith, one of the engineers, spun dials to get a proper balance. When he finally flashed the thumbs up, Paul stubbed out his cigarette into an ashtray, cleared his throat, and delivered a, quote, remarkably controlled take of a ballad that would become the most recorded song of all time. They're talking about yesterday.
Oh.
So to me, it's just funny to think about, okay, let's get John, George, and Ringo out of the way. Let's make sure all these things are in. Okay, Paul, put out the cigarette. Then within 10 minutes, the song that has been recorded more than any other song in history, there it is. And it's the way they make it sound so simple right there. There's Paul in the chair with his guitar.
And the fact that it's written, it's written in scene. It's written almost like something you'd read in a novel.
Right.
And I always think about the degree of research that must have gone into history that is written that way.
Right, yeah.
That's pretty incredible. So the whole book kind of reads that way?
Yes.
So that, something I want to ask everyone for this particular series of Page Turners involving WABE hosts is, what makes this a good summer read? And that sort of seems to speak to it.
Yeah, well, it goes to what you were saying about how it almost seems like it's not just a biography, but it almost seems like it's a fascinating book. And for me, especially in summer, whenever it's not a nice time to go to the pool or something like that, and you just want to do something to relax, you can sit in a chair, open it up, and just read a chapter or two. It almost feels like you're watching a movie in your head, a familiar movie in your head, that you've seen this movie before, you know how it's going to end, but you still enjoy being in that moment.
Yeah, it sounds really comforting.
Yeah.
So you said a few minutes ago that the Beatles were sort of underdog figures in the beginning. They're from Liverpool, and it was just sort of this nowheresville town. I couldn't help but draw a parallel. You and I are from the same sort of nowheresville town, or it was considered that way for many years. I'm not going to say that about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today, because I don't think of it that way.
No.
But I'm just so curious, John Lorinc, about where your fandom for the Beatles came from. Was it that sense of the underdog, or what was it about for you?
Well, I do remember this, actually. It's a very specific memory. I was probably about 3 or 4 years old, and we were driving on Ohio River Boulevard, which I'm sure you've been on before, and my dad's red Volkswagen Rabbit, and All You Need Is Love came on the radio. And I remember after the song ended or it was fading out, and I said, "Who is that?" And my dad said, "Oh, that's the Beatles." And we came back home, and my dad pulled out records. You remember vinyl? And for a couple years after that, whenever birthday presents or something, I wouldn't ask for toys or something. I'd ask for Beatles records. You know, so I'm like 6 years old and I have the White Album. And I love other groups too, don't get me wrong. But if I have to go to a desert island with only one group, it's going to be the Beatles.
What album?
Revolver's my favorite Beatles album.
John Lorinc, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I could talk all day. We could, you want to do some more?